Bom, pessoal, a Jennifer, vou fazer uma introdução aqui com o material que tem no LinkedIn sobre ela, né? Ela tem mais do que aparece aqui, né? Não dá para mostrar tudo aqui agora, mas fundamentalmente vai interessar para nós o trabalho que ela fez no doutorado dela, né? Que foi feito entre 2010 e 2018. O tema foi o Building Information Modeling na parte de educação de projeto colaborativo, né? Esse aqui é o título dele e recentemente a Regina me passou um texto que é um extrato da dissertação, a gente vai deixar isso disponível depois, né, Regina? E a partir de então, ela vem trabalhando em outras áreas, né, mas sempre na área de BIM e correlatos, né, passou pelo Buildings Smart, passou aqui pelo, desculpa que está cortado por causa do PDF, né, um período aqui no PCSG, né, durante o sabático, sabático livre, e voltou a trabalhar aqui na Universidade de Tecnologia de Sydney, passou pelo Macdonald e atualmente, lá logo para a posição atual, ela está como, deixa eu ver aqui, desculpa, cortou aqui, né? Aqui na Bentley System, no Cohesive, que antigamente era chamado PCSG, que é uma área da Bentley no Reino Unido. Como eu já falei, ela vai apresentar um tema mais relacionado à tese do doutorado dela, que faz mais relação com a nossa área de ensino de BIM. Well, Jennifer, I will allow you to share your screen.
Okay.
And you can start the presentation.
Okay. Right. Let's see this works.
Ela vai fazer então uma apresentação mais curta, de 30 minutos, a gente vai restringir.
Rapidamente. Sim. Obrigada pelo convite de novo e desculpa. So I'll speak in English to avoid offending everyone with my bad Portuguese accent, but I'm going to just talk to you briefly about the project that I did for my PhD. So it's been a couple of years now. I've been working, as we just said, in industry for the company's now called Cohesive, but it used to be PCSG, and then we were acquired by Bentley Systems, which is a large American software company that specializes in infrastructure, but our part of the business does consultancy around BIM and digital twins, but I still keep doing teaching as well to different universities around the world, and keep up with a lot of what I was doing in the framework and industry training as well. So I know, I'll just see if I can get the right screen. So the project came out of, at the time, several years ago, all around the world, people were adopting BIM, government bodies were adopting it, and many government clients as well. So you could see all around the world different organisations that were involved. In the UK, you probably know a lot of the background to this, but we had various reports saying we could do better. Every new government that we had in the UK kept investigating the construction industry and saying it was working in a really bad way. There was there were many disputes, lots of legal challenges, lots of money being wasted on rework and on fighting in the courts. But every report said that change was needed and then nothing really happened. Then we had the financial crisis, of course, in 2008, although a lot of things have happened since then that make that seem quite small in some ways. But essentially, the government ran out of money and said, we've got to find a way of delivering our infrastructure projects for less money. So they went back and did what the government in the UK loved doing, which is to produce another report. But this is the government construction strategy. And that was back in May 2011. And actually, one of the guys that was in charge of the task group that wrote this report. He's now actually my boss at Cohesive, so that's how he's involved in this as well. But at the time, this was a bit different. I hope I translated this correctly, but it came with a mandate. So by mandate, in the UK, the government at the time was responsible for around 30 to 40% of new build work in the construction sector. So by them saying you must work this way, it was a major client with lots of money saying you must work this way. So it's not a law, but it was a mandate that came out saying if you want to work with us, you need to work this way. So that made everyone pay attention. And they decided to look 5 years ahead. So they said 2016, we think that's about enough time for the industry to make these changes. But they also recognised that they needed to be specific about what they wanted and to set that out in standards, which are now filtering through into the ISO 19650 series. So the original mandate will require fully collaborative 3D BIM with all projects and asset information, documentation and data being electronic as a minimum. And I guess, I don't know what the situation is like in Brazil, but the problem with this statement in the UK is that everyone immediately focused on the 3D BIM bit. And so a lot of people think it's just still, you're having conversations where people think it's just the 3D model, it's just technology, and we can somehow just buy it off the shelf. So it's still, I'm having conversations today in the UK with clients that think this. So it worked from the point of view of getting going, but it's also been a bit problematic from that. And they also had objectives that they said in the 2025 report that came out a couple of years after that sort of said we can improve some of these other things. One of the big things you might be interested in the UK is that they want to improve the trade deficit, because in the UK we're very much a sector services-based economy, and so by developing all the British standards around BIM, it also meant that they could go to other countries around the world and say, look at our amazing standards, do you want some? We can give you them, and it's worked to some extent, although I think people are a bit disappointed perhaps that the ISOs have now come out, international standards, and that's the background. But that's just a little bit of background to what was happening in the UK. At the time I was in Australia when I was doing this project, but a lot of what the UK does has an impact in Australia. They're still very close countries. You're probably familiar with the McLeamy curve. It's all about how you move the work up front. So actually, a lot of the stuff around BIM is really about process and process improvement and the people side. But I think in our industry, we tend to be quite technical people, and we just want to fix things with technology. And so some of the idea behind this was the end of the master builder. No one's able to solve all the problems. You can't adjust the architect or the contractor in charge. It's got to be a collaborative effort. And so we were seeing more of the collaborative working in practice, where everyone comes together and works on projects collaboratively. But the problem was that education was lacking behind all of this. So it was industry driving it, saying we need change in the way that we work, but we're still continuing to educate our disciplines separately. Apologies for the Spanish on this slide as well, but there's a sibling rivalry. So we've got the problem still that there's a lot of mistrust in the construction industry. So architects tend to hate engineers, and engineers think architects are just trying to make things difficult, and vice versa. The contractors hate everyone. No one really understands how the others work or what they need from the process. And it's a real blame game that we have. And even now it's a problem. So when you're doing BIM and you're trying to send different models or information between the different disciplines, it's just almost like chuck it all out there and hope some of it works or not. And what we're actually doing with BIM and with digital twins is trying to simulate the real world in a digital way. And so we need to sort of really try to think about how we work together. So my project, I was looking at all of this and thinking, well, we're educating students in disciplinary silos. I had the benefit when I did my first degree of it being a collaborative course. So it was called Building Design Engineering. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, that course. But we studied architecture and civil structural engineering and services engineering for all through the course. So the first 2 years we did a bit of all the disciplines, and then we specialised in third year. So in Scotland you do 4 years as your bachelor's degree. So I specialised in structural engineering, but a lot of my classmates went into architecture, services engineering, and all the way through we continue to do collaborative projects. And it's kind of interesting now when I look at my colleagues from that course, because most of them have ended up in some sort of BIM role or other kind of more collaborative kind of areas like facade engineering, fire engineering, and so on. So although it was a small course, it actually had quite a big influence in our future careers in this area. So so when I was at the University of South Australia, I went to my professor at the time and said I want to do my PhD on BIM, and I think I want to focus on the education area and how we could improve collaboration. And she at the time said, "What's BIM?" and then just watched it all kind of take off. So it was quite nice to be in that position. It was called Code BIM, which stands for Collaborative Design Education Using BIM. I was very lucky at the time that I also managed to time it well and got supported by a grant from the Australian government, because they'd just coincidentally had a letter written by one of the main professional bodies in Australia saying, we want you to be looking at education and what's going on in this area. So it was good timing. And it was to develop a framework to help academics to implement principles of collaborative BIM throughout the curriculum. And I worked, the core partners in that project were UniSA, University of South Australia, where I was doing my PhD, University of Technology Sydney, where I eventually ended up working, and the University of Newcastle in Australia. So at first I went and looked at all the different universities that were offering all 3 disciplines, and at the time they were offering like BIM courses, but mostly they were in architecture, and they were mostly sort of focused on single subjects or just the modelling side. And I also looked at the various universities around the world, particularly in the States, and which ones taught all 3 subjects together. And at the time, it was very rare to have, never minding BIM, but it was very rare to have collaboration between the 3 disciplines happening. There was a lot of pretend collaboration, so maybe it might have been in an architecture class, pretend you're a structural engineer for this. And there was a lot of, we're not teaching students to press buttons. So in academia, as you probably are all aware, well, it's maybe different in Brazil, but in the UK and Australia, there's a real resistance to teaching practical courses. It's kind of seen as something that's left for industry to do, and any kind of sort of thought of teaching anything to do with software, there's quite a lot of resistance because it's seen as not being high-minded, not being academic, that kind of thing. I did find when I was in Chile that there's more of a focus on the practical and on kind of almost like training students for their professional careers, and in Colombia as well. So I'm guessing that maybe Brazil is a bit more focused on that you're actually developing students to go into professions. And a lot of the kind of English-speaking world, it's very much like there's a separation of academia and industry. So there were also challenges about how to create new courses in a crowded curriculum. There's always like people feeling pressure that are getting more and more, and like, oh, this is another thing you're dumping on me. Resistance to change, it's the same in industry as well as academia. When I moved into academia in the first place, I was thinking, oh wow, everyone will want to change and be forward thinking and work together, and it was not like that at all generally. There is a problem in trying to keep up to date if you're not like hands-on or day-to-day in industry, to be aware of some of the changes in technology, and also bridging the silos between the disciplines, because there was that same resistance. And I remember having some funny conversations in Sydney, and a lot of colleagues in engineering immediately assumed that I was an architect, and they really didn't want to share anything with me until I managed to sort of tell them that I was actually an engineer myself, and then that kind of broke down the barrier. But it was kind of funny, but also pretty bad at the same time. The numbers of students are continuing to increase in, I think, most places around the world, and it was really, in Australia, as it has been in the UK, the government's been cutting a lot of funding to universities. So it's about, how do we pack the maximum number of students we can fit in a classroom, get the money from them, focus on your research activities, those were big problems. Timetabling, as soon as you start to do collaborative courses, you've got to match different disciplines, and it's a pretty boring subject, but really difficult to get right. And then resources, of course, it's how do you get access to any particular tools you need, teaching time, all sorts of things like that. So there were some of the initial challenges that I came across. Also, when do you introduce BIM or BIM concepts? So if we think about developing BIM or digital twins, and you're really simulating a real life construction project. So if you try to introduce all that to students in the first year, it's very difficult because they don't have all the sort of knowledge. So, but if you try to introduce everything to them in the final year, then you're trying to, again, it's a lot to take on. And how do you evaluate the development of collaborative design skills? So collaboration can be quite a strange thing to assess, right? So how do you know that understanding or that way of working is improved? That was another big question. And also, again, it might be more English-speaking world specific, I'm not sure, but getting the buy-in from the professional bodies. So in Australia, just showing how argumentative Australian industry is, even the professional bodies don't talk to each other. So particularly in building. So you've got one institution for the architects in Australia and one for all the engineers. But for building, you've got the Australian Institute of Builders, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors, Australian Institute of Building Surveyors, and the Chartered Institute of Building, and they don't talk to each other. That was one of the first things I was told, was don't speak to them. So each of them set their different accreditation criteria without talking to each other. And you could, as part of my project, I was overlaying a lot of them and trying to see, well, what are some of the common requirements? Because that was one way to get change going. If the professional bodies said, for you to keep your course accredited with us, you need to be teaching these concepts or subjects. And so it was by talking to them, we're trying to, first of all, look at what their existing criteria were. Could you actually match them more easily by tweaking your curriculum? Then that's kind of a win-win for everyone. I'd also looked at the States in my travels around, because there were some standout courses at the time. So again, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of things like Penn State. They were some of the early pioneers in a lot of the BIM and collaborative working. Auburn University were doing great things in construction and so on. So I looked at some of their courses and what they were doing in terms of collaborative working. So I developed my framework, and it coincidentally ended up being called IMAC, so it's not just because I'm Scottish and my surname, but it works quite well. So illustration stage is the very beginning, then manipulation, application, and collaboration. So it's got 4 stages to it, but it doesn't necessarily have to correspond with like each year level of university. It's just it's based on a constructivist approach and assuming that you're building on previous knowledge as you go through. So again, and trying to deal with the educational academic work, I matched the stages of the framework to various educational taxonomies. So Bloom's is obviously one that most people are familiar with in education. And the idea was, how do you push students to the upper levels of Bloom's? So it's not about just regurgitating knowledge or repeating lists. It's actually about what we all want to get to as teachers, is to get students thinking for themselves, developing new knowledge, that kind of thing. And an alternative framework that I looked at was BIGS as well, and it's similar ideas of moving to sort of really getting into in-depth understanding and creating of new ideas. So then I looked at developing a kind of some tools that academics could use, first of all, to map where their existing courses were. So again, the idea was trying not to have to create new subjects. So it was about, you can map where you are across the main, and again, this is trying to match across the different disciplines. So you could use it whether you were in architecture, engineering, or construction management. And you could use that to benchmark where your course was and then where you wanted to be. So it wasn't necessarily about being at collaborative level across all of your different subjects or disciplines. There might be some things that you just need to have knowledge of if you're in engineering versus like deep disciplinary understanding in a different discipline. So this is just one where I took a construction management course and mapped all of their courses. So I looked through what courses they were teaching, what kind of concepts they were covering. And in this case, it was just very traditional. So they had sort of subjects taught in isolation and just teaching as they'd always done, the different topics, the different disciplinary knowledge. And then working with the academic from the course, we looked at where they wanted to be in terms of BIM themes, collaborative working themes as well. So another thing that I was looking at was obviously there's some situations and the initial courses that I examined, it was looking at universities that taught all three disciplines, so architecture, engineering and construction together. And then quite often I had the question, well, what happens if you've only got construction and you don't have the other disciplines? But actually, and I guess maybe you think this is obvious, it wasn't to me when I first went into academia, but I actually found it was almost easier to collaborate with disciplines in other institutes or other universities. So say you've got a construction course in one university and then you've got an architecture course in a different one. It was actually easier in some ways to get collaboration because I found that academia was quite a competitive kind of environment. So within your own institution, you can quite often have that competitiveness, and it's difficult to be able to collaborate with your own colleagues. And plus, they also might just have completely different interests to you. They might not be interested in teaching at all, whatever. So it was actually easier sometimes to find a like-minded colleague in a different institution. The other thing that helps is that with timetabling, sometimes actually, again, in different institutions, it's easier to work out the timetabling for a single collaborative subject, that kind of thing. So some people were surprised by that, other people not so much. So I also looked at different courses based on the literature around the world and then mapped them to the different stages to provide sort of examples of where courses have been developed that would fit into these different stages. So I experimented on my own students as well. So we had these new collaborative classrooms in UTS in Sydney, and I had a lot of industry friends that would lean on it. They all became a bit aware of me approaching them with a beer and saying, "Oh, just sign here and like come and teach my course." But again, it was about trying to get industry expertise in and showing like different disciplines coming in and working with the students. And we had a space where they could use lots of different tools to work together. And it was at collaboration stage, this particular class. So I had students from all the disciplines, so architecture, engineering, construction, at their final year working together and developing collaborative projects. So the other interesting, the university did throw a lot of spanners in the works, as we'd say in English for me. So the course actually ended up being really, really popular. And so they thought, great, we'll just send more and more students in, but then it almost becomes impossible to try and run a studio when you just get, your whole class is full. So, but it actually gave me some benchmarking data, which is maybe kind of unusual for a class like this, because I split it into two classes where I had one that was in large group modes with mostly kind of single disciplines. Sometimes it was a mixed discipline, but trying to teach them the same kind of concepts as I had with this other class that I split into a studio where they had, like you can see in this picture, groups of students that were a mix of all the different disciplines. So I was able to compare the knowledge that they developed, as well as trying to apply some of the techniques to the larger class, but in a way that was adapted. So this one, I was just showing all the different methods of communications. There's one guy just with pen and paper, another one with his iPads, laptop, mobile phones, and they've got a smart screen as well, but trying to hide away from the picture. So one of the projects actually finished up on at UTS was working quite closely with the library. And it was quite interesting at university that their chief librarian was really, really into technology, and they were doing a lot of work to try and get students engaged with the library as well and to develop the space. And they had a problem in that it was they're moving in, or they were at last count moving into a brand new space, but they were trying to use the existing library building that was in a slightly dodgy or not so good area of Sydney at night. So they wanted to improve the security, and he wanted to connect the floors together so that if students were working at night, they could feel safe. And the librarian acted as a client, and it was actually a project that they were thinking about doing in real life. I provided the students with an IFC model that they could work off of, and they were told they can use whatever tools that they want. The focus wasn't on the software, though. It was on the working together, working with the client, understanding what their requirements were. I also involved the head of facilities management, because again, in industry, this is the problem that a lot of the projects that we see, they don't really involve the end user, the client. So it's trying to, again, encourage them to think about starting with the end in mind. So what are your clients' requirements? What do they need you to deliver to run their project more effectively? So what you're seeing here actually is some of the renders that the student teams produced, or their ideas. So this is one where they actually created a bridge across. So we had the final project, we had 6 multidisciplinary teams with civil engineers, construction and architecture students, and there was a small prize available to encourage participation, but they're quite a competitive lot anyway. So, but the other thing you might notice from this slide is I involved different year groups as well. So one of the things that I'd found was that the way that the architecture courses run, a lot of the earlier years focus more on the kind of theory of architecture and just, again, doing everything in isolation. And then what happens, at least in Australia, is in the 4th year they go out to work for a year in practice with architecture firms. And there's quite a change in them when they come back, because they kind of realise that, okay, it's we have to actually understand what BIM is, because the industry is using it, even if we're not being taught it at university, and we have to work more collaboratively. So you tended to get students were a bit easier to work with when they came back to do their master's year. The civil and the construction students that I had, I don't know if any of you have been to Australia, but they're quite, you're never left doubting what a construction student's thinking at any time, put it that way. They're very confident. And I found that they would tend to terrify a lot of the engineering and architecture students if they were in a younger year. So there were lots of learning outcomes for me as well as students in this course, but it kind of works with that split. So the most senior students from architecture, and then the engineers being in their senior year, and then the 3rd year construction students, that kind of work quite well. So some of the things that we learned together, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Tuckman team stages, but at one point I was actually teaching the students about this, and then kind of realizing that I was observing this in practice. So one of the big things I had with these courses, because it was a bit different to how they'd usually been doing their other courses, when I started, I had a lot of students, even in the bigger class, they would have to go and research topics and come back and lead a group discussion and present back and gather the findings, and they didn't like this at first. There was always the first 2 or 3 weeks they'd be like, why are we doing this, and you're the teacher, why aren't we just sitting here and you teaching us stuff? But then you get to about week 3 and they would suddenly go, oh, actually we quite like this, is interesting, we're getting involved, and things would always move a bit smoother from that. But it was like every year you observed kind of the same thing. So for the initial stages, is if you're teaching these kind of subjects, you need to really be involved and guiding the students through, and then they get to the norming stage and things become a bit easier and they just keep working. But I think that's the same in most new things, most new projects. The other interesting thing was not being too prescriptive in the project. So, and there is a lot of research behind this, saying that when you have members of the teams able to feel that they've got some autonomy, so that they can work independently, that can actually help collaboration. But when you've defined what each person's role is, so what are they going to do in a job? What's their goal? But then you leave that path open to them, that can actually help collaboration. So yeah, so I guess it's like collaborative problem solving, like how can they get together to solve this as a team? Sorry about the order of this. So as I said, the initial stages when you're introducing something, even students, and they're younger, but they still, a lot of them, change is uncomfortable, doing things differently is uncomfortable, so you've got to be prepared to put a bit more effort in perhaps than you would in a traditional course to guide them through. So it does help if you've got, I mean, not just trying to promote my framework here, but if you've got these kind of building blocks where they're actually learning things gradually and building, and that it makes it a lot easier than trying to introduce everything again for that uncomfortable stage 2. I said peer learning worked quite well, so having that mix of or heterogeneous age group or experience group was useful. I did compare the 2 groups with a very large class and the slightly more hands-off approach versus the actual getting in and working in a simulated professional environment. That there wasn't quite a sort of deep understanding of collaboration in the bigger group, but they still improved. And I think there were positive experiences on both sides. So I quite enjoyed getting in and working and helping the students solve problems. I mean, you're always getting different things coming up, and it's quite an interesting way to work. And a lot of the students in their feedback gave very, very positive experiences, and some of them actually, they would say things like, oh, I thought that architects are all weird or engineers are rubbish or whatever, and when I started this course and I realized they're actually okay, it was that kind of response that you got back from them. I was looking at how you can assess collaborative group work. So this one is from Fruchter, who she did quite a lot of work early on in this area, and she'd suggested that you've got different levels of understanding, from island, aware, appreciative, understood. So I took some of these together with another framework that's just gone off the top of my head for collaborative teamwork, and I used those in the assessment of the collaboration. So I had to sort of come up with some ways of trying to show, because you've also got to show students that that they're being graded against clear objectives, clear goals. So so it's trying to develop some around these. It was quite tricky, but got there, I think, in the end. Just something I thought I mentioned in passing is in the UK, there's the BIM Academic Forum that was also developed to help embed some of these ideas in the UK universities. And they also took that Fruchter's ideas of absent, aware, infused, and embedded, so slightly different names, but they talked about different levels of BIM academic engagement as well. And just thought I'd finish with one of the things that in the final project running, this is the chief librarian, he said that 4 out of 6 student teams delivered better presentations than they'd seen from their colleagues in industry. So I wasn't quite sure whether to be just really proud of my students or to despair at industry, but yeah, they actually took some of the ideas on board, so the students were quite proud of that as well. But I was always telling the students that we need T-shaped people, so people that have understanding across the different disciplines as well as deep understanding of their own, and it helps. It's what the industry needs, I think. But that's basically, I'm not sure I did for time there, sorry I went a bit over, but that's, I don't know if there's anything in particular you'd like me to cover, talk about. I know I speak very quickly, so apologies.
Jennifer, thank you for your thoughts and for your presentation. I think the time is very, very short to assimilate everything.
Yes, sorry. I'll say I'm happy to speak separately with people and to practice my Portuguese as well. My teacher would be very happy. So,
with almost all Portuguese sentences, we will show. It was very, very easier to understand, but even the short presentation and the lots of information, and we have to assimilate with more time and pace them.
Sure.
But Regina has at least one question or two, no more than this, because of the time is.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. It was very interesting. I had a focus on your IMAC framework with the illustration. What are the 4 stages? Illustration,
manipulation, application, and collaboration. So at the very early stages, you can be using BIM tools to illustrate how things fit together. So I mean, one of the things I used to teach that I was in my previous life as a structural or facades engineer, I did a lot of finite element analysis. And the traditional way that's taught, for example, is just using matrices and mass and so on. But what I would do would actually be to show a model of something in reality, break it down, show a simulation of failure, and the student can then understand, and then you can refine it from there. So whereas the way I remember being taught it, it was just all very theoretical. So it's things like that. Some things you can use the tools to try and explain in a new way how things work. So introducing some of the flavors of what the other disciplines are doing, that might be at illustration level. And then, but you know, students are still quite hands-off at that stage. You're just illustrating the concepts, and then you've got some manipulation, which might be where they're going in and actually starting to try out things themselves. And an application would be where they're actually working fully in their discipline. So it's like, so you're getting to the top of the T, and then when you get to collaboration, they should be ready in terms of having some of that, you know, the base knowledge that they need in their disciplines, as well as some of the base knowledge and the tools that they might be using, so that when they come to work with the other disciplines, they can then actually properly get the most out of it by simulating that proper collaborative working. So as their own discipline, but as part of a collaborative team.
Yes, and I thought, I always looked at your work through this framework. But today, you pointed out two things that I thought was very nice. First was the Tuckman team stages: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. I have applied this myself, but in other situations of training. And I do emphasize our colleagues here to look this, because this is really nice when you want to build a team. And the pressure assessment stages, this framework for assessing collaboration. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. So I was just trying to find there's if I can find where it is. I can send you some more information on it, but there was, I took a document that had been produced on collaborative teamwork, and it was for a completely different area as well, but it was about looking at what are some of the key observations or key ways of working that people exhibit when they're working most effectively in teams. So it was trying to find evidence of that when you're assessing the students working in the teams, and their approach to conflict is one of them. How do they address that? But is it Rani Fruchter that her name is? There's a lot of work that
Renate Fruchter from
I forget where she is now. I think she was at Harvard at one point.
Harvard,
I'm not sure she's still there, but there's some of her papers. So she was one, and then the other reference I was just thinking about, it was just completely out of my head. It's been a crazy week, but yeah, I looked at those kind of different mappings that they'd use, and there was this other piece where they looked at what some of the common themes were to successful teams or collaborative teams, and it was trying to develop a kind of rubric that you could then use that to apply. But I'm happy to share that with you separately if I wanted to get out.
Okay. Well, for me, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else has another question.
The score is 3-1, by the way, apparently. So just for the pitfall.
There's lots of thoughts, lots of questions, but I think the time is short, and we only thank you very, very much for the presentation. In the chat, we send a link for another paper about your framework, and the people can read and can have some other questions and send to you to your email.
I can maybe share the final findings, because I was meant to write more papers, but then I ended up moving back to the UK and getting a bit wrapped up in a completely different type of work. But yeah, I'd be happy to share that as get more detail on it as well. And it's nice to see people using what I did. So yeah.
Thank you.